The floor beneath my feet was still warm from the last patrol, and my sensors were already screaming that something on this station was wrong. 11 minutes. That was all the time we had before the automated systems would detect the breach and lock every corridor on this ring. 11 minutes to find the intruders and stop them before the whole station turned into a sealed box with predators already inside it. My name is Vesik Turan, and I have spent 19 years wearing the uniform of the Halvan Coalition. I have fought in 3 border conflicts and survived 2 ambushes that killed everyone else in my unit. I know what fear smells like on a dozen different species. I know how fast a Kalith soldier can move, how a Threndi warrior breathes before it charges, how an Orlan gunner counts silently to steady its aim. I thought I knew everything about combat that mattered. I did not know a single true thing about humans. The human assigned to my unit that day was a young woman named Elise Marlowe. She had transferred in 3 weeks earlier as part of the joint defense agreement between our fleets, and in that time she had said maybe 40 words to me in total. She filled out reports precisely. She stood at the back during briefings. She never raised her voice, never postured, never tried to prove herself the way new officers from other species always did. My superiors had warned me, half joking, that humans were the weakest combatants in the Alliance. Soft muscles, slow reflexes, emotional creatures who needed months of training just to stop hesitating before a fight. I had read the reports myself. Humans ranked near the bottom of every combat efficiency chart the Coalition kept. So when the alert came through my earpiece that morning, sharp and urgent, telling us hostile operatives had somehow slipped past 3 layers of station security and were now hiding somewhere inside Ring 4, I assumed Marlowe would follow my lead and stay a careful step behind me. That is what the doctrine said humans did. They followed. They hesitated. They needed someone else to make the first move. I was wrong before I even opened my mouth to give the order. Confirmed intrusion. Unknown number of hostiles. Ring 4. Sector 9. The comms officer said, her voice tight with static. Command wants that ring cleared and secured before the automated alarm triggers full lockdown. You have 11 minutes. After that, the doors seal, and nobody gets in or out until command manually overrides, and that override takes 40 minutes minimum. 40 minutes was a lifetime if hostiles were already inside a sealed section with hostages, with control panels, with anything they could use against us. I looked at Marlowe. She was already moving toward the transport tube, checking the charge on her sidearm with the same unhurried calm she used to check a coffee dispenser. "Marlowe," I said, falling into step beside her, "we wait for backup at the ring entrance. Standard procedure is to hold position until at least 4 additional units arrive." She glanced at me, and for the first time I noticed her eyes were not nervous at all. They were flat and clear, like still water. "There isn't time for that," she said. "If they reach an alarm panel before we reach them, everyone behind those doors is trapped with whatever they brought in. We go now." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not respect, it was irritation, the kind of irritation a senior officer feels when a junior partner ignores established protocol. I had 19 years of experience telling me that a lone human, however calm she appeared, was not equipped to handle an unknown number of hostiles without support. I opened my mouth to remind her of the chain of command. The tube doors closed before I finished the sentence, and we were already descending toward Ring 4. The transport ride took 90 seconds, but it felt much longer. I used the time to study her the way I had studied hundreds of soldiers before a mission, looking for the signs that told you how someone would perform under pressure. A trembling hand, a too fast pulse visible at the neck, eyes that moved too quickly, searching for exits. Marlowe had none of these things. Her breathing was even. Her hands were steady on the strap above her head. If anything, she looked like someone waiting for a routine transport to a routine assignment, not someone walking into a sealed ring with hostiles already inside. "You've done this before," I said. It wasn't really a question. "Something like this," she said, and did not elaborate. The doors opened onto a narrow access corridor, lined with maintenance panels and emergency lighting that had already switched to a low amber glow, a sign the station's systems sensed the disturbance, even before the alarm formally triggered. 9 minutes remaining. I drew my weapon and gestured for Marlowe to take a position behind me, the standard formation for advancing into unknown territory. She nodded, but as we moved forward I noticed she was not actually behind me. She was beside me, matching my pace exactly, her attention already sweeping the corridor ahead in a pattern I did not recognize from any human training manual I had studied. We reached the first junction, a T intersection where the corridor split toward the main control room on one side and the residential block on the other. This was where the intelligence report said the hostiles were most likely headed, toward the control room, where a single alarm trigger would seal the entire ring and give them exactly the chaos they needed to disappear into the station's lower levels. I raised a hand to signal a stop, intending to check the intersection with a scanner before advancing further. Marlowe was already past me. She moved without any sound at all. I do not mean she moved quietly the way a trained soldier moves quietly, careful and deliberate, each footstep placed with conscious effort. I mean, there was simply no sound, as though the corridor itself had agreed to hold its breath around her. One moment she was beside me, and the next she was at the intersection, already turning toward the control room side, her weapon lowered, but her whole body coiled with a kind of readiness I had never seen described in any combat manual. "Report says 3 life signs ahead," she said quietly, tapping the small scanner clipped to her wrist. 2 stationary, 1 moving toward the control panel. 8 minutes remained on the countdown, ticking silently in the corner of my vision display. 8 minutes until the alarm sounded, and this entire ring became a locked box. I felt my pulse quicken, the old familiar tightening in my chest that came before every engagement I had ever survived. I looked at Marlowe, expecting to see some version of that same tension in her, some sign that she understood the weight of what we were about to do. Instead, she looked almost bored, not careless, not indifferent to the danger, just entirely, completely calm, the way a technician looks calm before opening a familiar piece of equipment they have repaired 100 times before. "Stay here," she said. "I'll clear it." I laughed. I actually laughed, a short disbelieving sound that echoed strangely in the amber-lit corridor. 3 hostiles, alone, without backup, without even raising her weapon into a ready position. Every instinct built from 19 years of service told me this was reckless, that a single soldier moving alone into an unknown number of armed hostiles was the fastest way to end up as a casualty report. "That is not how this works," I said, keeping my voice low but firm. "We approach together. We assess. We wait for the second unit if needed." Marlowe turned to look at me, and there was something in her expression that I would spend the rest of that day trying to understand. It was not anger, it was not impatience exactly. It was closer to the look a parent gives a child who has just said something innocently wrong, a kind of gentle correction mixed with something almost sad. "Vesic," she said, using my name for the first time since she had transferred to our unit. "If we wait, that alarm sounds in 8 minutes, and this whole ring locks down with those hostiles still inside it. Do you know what's in the residential block on the other side of that control room?" I did know. 42 civilian technicians and their families, housed there while the station underwent maintenance work on the lower decks. 42 people who would be sealed inside a locked section with armed intruders and no way for security to reach them for at least 40 minutes. "I know," I said. "Then you know we don't have time for 4 more units to arrive," she said. "I need you to trust me for the next 90 seconds. After that, you can write whatever report you want about how I handled it." I did not answer right away. Every part of my training told me to refuse, to hold my position and demand she wait for proper support. But there was something in her voice, some quiet certainty that did not match anything in the human combat reports I had studied, and against every instinct built over 19 years, I stepped back and let her go. She walked toward the control room door without hurry, without any visible weapon raised, moving the way someone might walk into an empty room to check if the lights had been left on. The door was slightly ajar, damaged during the initial breach, and through the gap I could see the edge of a control console and the shadow of someone moving near it. 7 minutes remained. I raised my scanner, watching the 3 life sign markers glow faintly on the small display, 2 clustered near the far wall and 1 closer to the door, moving with the restless energy of someone counting down the same seconds I was. My weapon was drawn, my finger resting just outside the trigger guard, the way I had been trained since my earliest days in service. Every muscle in my body was ready to move the moment Marlowe needed support. She reached the door and paused for exactly 1 second, her hand resting flat against the frame, her head tilted slightly as though listening to something beneath the low hum of the station's ventilation system. Then she stepped through, and the door swung shut behind her with a soft mechanical click that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the corridor. I stood there, alone, watching the 3 markers on my scanner and counting the seconds in my head the way I had counted seconds during every dangerous moment of my career. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. I strained to hear something through the door, a shout, the sound of struggle, anything that would tell me whether I needed to break protocol entirely and go in after her. There was nothing, no sound at all. At 15 seconds, one of the markers on my scanner blinked and went still. At 22 seconds, the second marker did the same. I felt something cold settle into my chest, a feeling I did not have a name for yet, something between disbelief and dread. I had seen soldiers move fast before. I had seen elite units clear rooms with practiced efficiency, weapons firing in controlled bursts, voices calling out clearances in the aftermath. What I was watching on that small glowing screen was something else entirely, something that did not match any pattern I had ever studied, and it was happening in complete silence on the other side of a door I had let her walk through alone. 6 minutes remained on the countdown when the 3rd marker went still. The door opened, and Elise Marlowe stepped back out into the corridor, her weapon still holstered, her expression exactly as calm as it had been 90 seconds earlier. Behind her, through the open doorway, I could see the control room, and I could see that the alarm panel, the one thing that would have sealed this entire ring and trapped 42 civilians with armed intruders, was untouched, its warning light still dark and silent. "Room's clear," she said. "Panel's secure. You can call it in." I did not move for a long moment. I simply stood there in the amber light of that corridor, staring at the woman my own doctrine had told me was the weakest soldier in the entire Coalition alliance, and I understood, with a kind of dawning horror that I would carry with me for a long time afterward, that everything I thought I knew about her people was built on a foundation that had never actually been tested. "How," I finally managed to say, "did you do that without a single sound reaching me through that door?" Marlowe looked at me for a moment, and something flickered behind her calm expression, something old and tired that did not belong on someone so young. "You'll want to sit down for the answer," she said quietly. "It's not a short one." Behind us, the countdown on my display continued ticking toward 0, but for the first time since the alert had come through, I was no longer afraid of what would happen when it reached the end. We did not sit down. There was no time for that, not with 6 minutes still ticking on the countdown and a station full of people who did not yet know how close they had come to disaster. But Marlowe walked with me back toward the transport tube at a pace that finally matched what I expected from a soldier who had just ended a confrontation with 3 armed hostiles, and in that walk, in the small details I had missed before, I began to see her differently. Her hands were not shaking, but they were not perfectly still either. There was a faint tremor in her right hand that she pressed flat against her thigh to steady, a small human gesture of controlled effort that I recognized now as something closer to discipline than emptiness. She had not felt nothing in that room. She had simply decided, before she ever opened that door, that whatever she felt would not be allowed to slow her down. "Command wants a full report before the ring reopens," I said into my comm unit, relaying the situation to the operations desk while keeping half my attention on Marlowe beside me. 3 hostiles neutralized, control room secure, alarm panel untouched, requesting medical and cleanup teams to Ring 4, Sector 9. The voice on the other end of the comm was quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that told me the operator was checking numbers against a clock that did not usually move this fast. "Confirmed, Officer Toran. That's..." That's 4 minutes ahead of projected timeline. Well done. 4 minutes. I looked at Marlowe, who was staring straight ahead down the corridor, her jaw set in a way that suggested she was thinking about something far away from this station. You saved 40 minutes of lockdown, I said. You saved 42 civilians from being trapped with those hostiles. Command is going to want to know exactly how you did what you just did. I know, she said. That's usually how it goes. There was something in the way she said usually that caught my attention immediately. Not this happened once, by chance, in an unusual situation. Usually, as though this was simply a pattern she had lived through before, a rhythm she already understood the shape of. We reached the transport tube, and as the doors closed around us, sealing us into that small metal box for the 90-second ride back up toward the command levels, I found myself studying her face the way I might study an unfamiliar star chart, looking for details that would help me understand a shape I did not yet recognize. Tell me something, I said. Before you walked through that door, what were you thinking? She was quiet for a moment, and I thought perhaps she would not answer at all. Then she spoke, her voice low and even, the same voice she had used throughout the entire encounter. I wasn't thinking about winning, she said. I wasn't thinking about being fast, or being strong, or proving anything to anyone. I was thinking about the layout of that room, about where each of them was standing, about which one would reach for a weapon first, and which one would reach for the alarm. I was thinking about the order things needed to happen in, and then I was making them happen in that order. That sounds like planning, I said, not instinct. It's both, she said. It has to be both, or it doesn't work fast enough to matter. The tube reached the command level, and the doors opened onto a corridor filled with officers moving quickly between stations, alerts still flashing on several displays as the station worked through the aftermath of the intrusion. As we walked toward the debriefing room, several officers turned to look at us, and I realized word had already spread about what had happened in Ring 4. A junior human officer, alone, 3 hostiles down, no alarm triggered, no shots fired that anyone had heard. I saw the reactions on their faces, the same disbelief I had felt standing outside that door, and beneath the disbelief, something else, a kind of unease that I recognized because I felt it too. We had all been taught the same doctrine. We had all read the same reports ranking human combat efficiency near the bottom of every chart the Coalition kept. And now here was a room full of experienced officers watching a young human woman walk past them without any visible mark of what she had just done, and none of us knew quite what to do with what we were seeing. Commander Issa Rendell was waiting for us at the debriefing room door, her expression carefully neutral in the way senior officers learn to hold their faces when they do not yet know how a situation should be categorized. "Officer Marlowe," she said. "Officer Turan, I've reviewed the preliminary report. I need to understand exactly what happened in that control room, and I need to understand it before this station's automated systems finish compiling their own incident report, because right now the machines are telling me something that doesn't match anything in our threat assessment database." "What is the machine telling you?" I asked. Commander Rendell turned her display toward us, and I saw a timeline stretched across the screen, marked with precise timestamps pulled from the station's internal sensors. The door opening, the first hostile life sign ending, the second, the third, the door opening again as Marlowe stepped back out. Total time inside that room, Rendell said quietly, was 11.4 seconds. I felt something shift in my chest, a recalculation of everything I thought I had witnessed. I had counted the seconds myself, standing in that corridor, and it had felt like a stretch of time, felt like something that took much longer than the numbers on that screen suggested. But the station's sensors did not lie, and 11.4 seconds was the total time between the door closing and 3 armed hostiles being rendered incapable of triggering an alarm that would have sealed an entire ring of the station. "That's not possible," said one of the other officers standing near the door, a Threndi soldier named Corin, who had served alongside me on 2 previous deployments. "No single operative moves that fast against 3 targets simultaneously without support. Not Caliph Special Forces, Not Orlan strike teams. Nobody. Apparently, Commander Rendell said, her eyes moving to Marlowe. Somebody does. Marlowe stood quietly through all of this, her hands folded in front of her, her expression giving away nothing. I had expected her to explain herself, to offer some justification or technical breakdown of exactly how she had accomplished what the station's own sensors struggled to categorize. Instead, she simply waited, the same patient stillness she had shown before walking through that door. "Officer Marlowe," Rendell said finally, "I need an explanation, and I need it to make sense within a report that other commanders across this alliance are going to read very carefully." "With respect, Commander," Marlowe said, "the explanation is simple. I assessed the threat. I moved to eliminate it before it could become a larger problem. The method matters less than the outcome, and the outcome was 42 civilians who never knew how close they came to real danger. The method matters a great deal to me," Rendell said, though not unkindly. "Because if what your species can do is what I think I just watched, then every threat assessment this alliance has built for the past decade needs to be reconsidered." I watched Marlowe's face carefully during this exchange, looking for some sign of pride, some flicker of satisfaction at having proven wrong every assumption the coalition held about her people. There was none of that. If anything, there was something like tiredness in her eyes, the look of someone who had explained this same thing many times before to many different officers, and who understood already how the conversation would end. "Commander," she said, "may I speak plainly?" "Please," Rendell said. "Your reports rank humans low on combat efficiency because you measured the wrong things," Marlowe said. "You measured how fast our muscles move compared to a Kalith soldier's. You measured how much weight we can carry compared to a Threndi warrior. You measured raw strength and raw speed, and you built your entire assessment on numbers that tell you almost nothing about what actually happens when a person decides, completely and without hesitation, that something has to end quickly." The room was silent. Corin, the Threndi officer, shifted uncomfortably near the door, and I noticed his hand had drifted, almost unconsciously, toward the sidearm at his hip, as though some old instinct in him recognized he was standing near something that his training had never prepared him to properly categorize. "You have soldiers who are stronger than us," Marlowe continued. "You have species who can run faster, lift more, survive injuries that would end a human life instantly. All of that is true, and none of it matters as much as your doctrine assumes it does, because speed of muscle was never the thing that decided what happened in that room. Speed of decision was." "Explain the difference," Rendell said quietly. "When your soldiers train for combat," Marlowe said, "they train to react. React to a threat. React to an enemy's movement. React to the situation as it develops in front of them. That reaction time is built into every combat simulation your doctrine is based on, and it's a real limitation, one that exists in every species I have ever encountered, including my own. But there is a difference between reacting to what is happening and already knowing what is about to happen before it does." I thought about the way she had paused outside that door, her hand resting flat against the frame, her head tilted as though listening. I thought about how she had told me, before walking through, that she already understood which hostile would reach for a weapon first and which one would reach for the alarm. "You already knew the layout of that room," I said slowly, understanding beginning to form. "You knew where they would be standing before you ever opened that door. I had 90 seconds in the transport tube to study the last available floor plan and cross-reference it with the scanner readings," Marlowe said. 90 seconds is enough time to build a complete picture of a room this size, enough time to predict, with reasonable confidence, where 3 people would likely be standing given the layout and the timeline of the intrusion. Once I had that picture, the rest wasn't reaction. It was execution of a plan that had already been decided before I ever touched that door. Commander Rendell leaned back slowly in her chair, absorbing what she had just heard. "You're saying your species doesn't fight faster. You fight with less delay between decision and action." "I'm saying my species has spent our entire history learning to compress that delay down to almost nothing," Marlowe said. "Not because we enjoy it. not because we're naturally suited to violence more than any other species in this alliance, but because for most of our history, hesitation meant death, and the ones who hesitated less were the ones who survived long enough to have children who also hesitated less. It isn't a talent, Commander. It's generations of pressure with nowhere else for it to go. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after she finished speaking. I found myself thinking about every human soldier I had ever served alongside, every quiet, unremarkable person who filled out reports precisely and stood at the back during briefings and never postured or bragged the way soldiers from other species often did. I had read all of that as weakness. I was beginning to understand it might have been something else entirely, a kind of restraint so deeply practiced that it had become invisible even to the people holding it. "There's more to this, isn't there?" Rendell said. "This isn't the first time your command has had to explain something like this." Marlowe's expression shifted, just slightly, and for the first time since I had met her 3 weeks earlier, I saw something that looked almost like reluctance. "No, Commander," she said. "It isn't the first time, and if you truly want to understand what you saw today, I'd suggest asking Officer Corrin what he remembers from the Velcane engagement 3 years ago. I believe he served alongside a human unit there." Every eye in the room turned to Corrin, who had gone very still near the door, his expression unreadable in a way that told me, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever he remembered from that engagement was something he had spent 3 years trying not to think about. The countdown that had been running in the corner of my vision since the alert first came through had reached 0 several minutes earlier, quiet and unremarked, the alarm that would have sealed Ring 4 never sounding at all because of 11.4 seconds inside a room I had not been allowed to enter. But a different kind of countdown was beginning now, one measured not in minutes until lockdown, but in how long it would take for every assumption this alliance held about the weakest species in its ranks to finish falling apart. Corrin did not speak right away. He stood near the door of that debriefing room for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point on the floor that none of the rest of us could see, and I understood that whatever memory Marlowe had just called forward was one he had buried carefully and did not want to dig up in front of a room full of officers. "Corrin," Commander Rendell said, her voice gentler now than it had been a moment earlier, "if there's something relevant to this incident, I need to hear it." He let out a long breath, the kind of breath a soldier takes before stepping into a memory he would rather leave alone, and finally he began to speak. "3 years ago," he said, "I was attached to a joint recovery mission near the Velcane debris field. A cargo vessel had been disabled by pirate raiders, and the crew, mostly civilian technicians and their families, had been taken as leverage while the raiders stripped the ship for anything valuable. My unit was sent in alongside a small human detachment, 6 soldiers, to recover the hostages before the raiders could move them off the vessel." He paused, and I saw his hand tighten slightly at his side. "We arrived to find the situation worse than intelligence had suggested. Not one group of raiders, but 3 separate crews who had converged on the same disabled vessel, each one unaware the others were aboard until we were already inside the wreck. 42 hostiles total, spread across a ship with almost no working lights and corridors flooded with drifting debris from the initial attack. My unit commander wanted to withdraw and request reinforcements. It was the sensible decision. Any of us would have made the same call given standard doctrine. What happened instead? Rendell asked quietly. The human unit commander, a woman named Dara Ashwell, told us there wasn't time, Corrin said. The hostages were being moved toward an escape pod bay, and once they were split up among 3 different pods, we would lose any realistic chance of recovering them all. She said her unit would go in immediately, and that we could either follow or wait for the reinforcements to arrive in 40 minutes, by which point everyone aboard that ship would either be dead or scattered across half a dozen unknown locations. I glanced at Marlowe, who was listening to this account with an expression that suggested she had heard some version of this story before, or perhaps had lived through something close enough to it that the details did not surprise her. I followed them in, Corrin continued, partly out of duty, partly, I will admit now, because I did not believe 6 human soldiers could survive contact with 42 armed raiders without support, and I did not want to explain to my commanders why I had let that happen without at least trying to help. What I saw over the following 6 minutes changed the way I have understood combat ever since, and I have never spoken about it in an official report because I did not believe anyone would accept what I actually witnessed. "Tell us," Rendell said. "They did not fight the way we fight," Corin said. "There was no formation, no covering fire, no coordinated advance, the way Threndi units train for engagement with numerically superior forces. Each of the 6 moved independently, but not randomly. It was as though they had already agreed, without speaking a single word to each other, on exactly which sections of that ship each person would take responsibility for. And once that agreement was made, they simply moved through those sections with a kind of quiet, terrible efficiency that I did not have words for at the time and still struggle to describe now." He looked down at his hands, turning them over slowly, as though checking they were still steady. "I was assigned to stay with 2 of the human soldiers as they cleared the lower cargo hold, where intelligence suggested a dozen raiders were guarding a portion of the stolen cargo. I expected gunfire. I expected shouting, alarms, the chaos that comes with any engagement against that many hostiles in an enclosed space. Instead, I watched 2 people move through that hold in under 2 minutes, and by the time it was over, every hostile inside had been neutralized, and not one of them had managed to raise an alarm or call for help from the other raider crews elsewhere on the ship. How is that possible against 12 armed opponents?" I asked, unable to stop myself. "I asked the same question," Corin said. "One of the soldiers, a young man named Tobias Hale, told me something I have thought about many times since. He said that people assume a fight against many opponents is harder than a fight against one, and in most ways that is true, but there is one advantage a larger group has against you that people rarely think about. In a crowded space, opponents often hesitate to act first, worried about hitting each other, worried about being the one who draws attention before they understand the full situation. That hesitation, even a fraction of a second, is enough time for someone who has already decided exactly what they are going to do." Marlowe nodded slightly at this, as though confirming something she already understood deeply. "He told me something else," Corin continued. "He said the goal was never to fight all 12 raiders as a single overwhelming force. The goal was to make sure that at any given moment, only one of them was actually a threat, because the others had already been removed from the equation before they understood what was happening to the ones beside them. By the time the 3rd or 4th raider realized something was wrong, there was no one left standing near them who could confirm what they were seeing, and confusion, more than anything else, was what kept the alarm from ever being raised." Commander Rendell had gone very still, listening to this account with the focused intensity of someone rewriting an internal assessment in real time. "What happened to the hostages?" she asked. "We recovered all 42 of them," Corin said. "Not one injury among the civilians. Not one alarm raised across the entire vessel, despite the presence of 42 hostiles who, individually, should have had ample opportunity to trigger some kind of warning to the other raider crews. When it was over, Dara Ashwell filed a report that I read afterward, and it was almost insultingly brief. 3 sentences describing the operation. No mention of casualties among the hostiles, though I had seen with my own eyes that none of them remained a threat by the end. No description of tactics, just a confirmation that the hostages were recovered and the vessel was secure." "Why so brief?" I asked. Corin was quiet for a moment before answering. I asked her that as well, afterward, once we were both back aboard our recovery ship, and the adrenaline had finally faded enough for conversation. She told me that detailed reports about how quickly and quietly her people could end a threat tended to make other species uncomfortable, and that her command had learned, over many years and many similar operations, that it was easier for everyone involved if humans simply did the job and let the results speak for themselves rather than drawing attention to the method. I felt something cold settle over me as I listened to this, a growing understanding that the calm, quiet, unremarkable humans I had served alongside throughout my career were not simply humble by nature. They had been deliberately, carefully underselling themselves for years, allowing the rest of the Alliance to believe in a version of their capabilities that was comfortable rather than accurate, because the truth made too many people uneasy. "You never reported what you saw," Rendell said to Corin. It was not quite an accusation, but it was close. "I did not know how to report it in a way that would be believed," Corin said. "And if I am honest, Commander, some part of me did not want to. What I witnessed in that cargo hold unsettled me more deeply than any battle I had fought before or since, not because of what was done, but because of how calmly it was done. There was no anger in it, no excitement, no satisfaction once it was finished." Tobias Hale checked each hostile methodically to confirm they no longer posed a threat, radioed a status update in the same flat voice you would use to report a routine equipment check, and then moved on to help secure the hostages. And I remember standing there afterward, feeling as though I had just watched something that the rest of the galaxy was not meant to see clearly. Marlowe spoke then, quietly, her eyes on Corin with something that looked almost like sympathy. "It unsettles most people who witness it directly for the first time," she said. "I understand why. There is a version of violence that people expect, one built around rage or fear or desperation, and when they see something calm and controlled instead, it feels wrong in a way that is hard to name. But calm is not the same as cruel, Officer Corin. What you watched in that cargo hold, and what I did in that control room, was never about anger. It was about making sure the people who needed protecting stayed safe, using the smallest possible amount of time and disruption to accomplish that. That is a difficult distinction for people to hold on to," Rendell said, "when the results look the way they do." "I know," Marlowe said. "It's why my command rarely explains it, and why most human soldiers you will ever serve alongside will never demonstrate it, unless the situation leaves no other choice. We are not eager to prove this capability exists. We would honestly prefer that most of the galaxy continue believing the doctrine your coalition built decades ago, because a species that is underestimated is rarely tested, and a species that is rarely tested has more room to choose peace whenever peace is possible." I thought about that for a long moment, turning it over in my mind alongside everything else I had witnessed and heard in the past hour. 19 years of service, and I had never once considered that the quiet, unremarkable behavior of human soldiers might be a deliberate choice rather than a natural limitation, a kind of restraint practiced so consistently and for so long that it had become almost indistinguishable from genuine weakness to anyone who had never seen it tested. "Why tell us now?" I asked Marlowe. "If your command prefers this stays hidden, why explain any of it to Commander Rendell, to me, to this entire room?" Marlowe considered the question carefully before answering. "Because today, 42 civilians in that residential block came within minutes of being trapped with armed hostiles. Because this station's defense doctrine assumed my unit would need backup that would have arrived too late to matter. Restraint has a cost, Officer Turan, and sometimes that cost is measured in how close we come to losing people we could have saved with a different approach. I would rather explain an uncomfortable truth to this room than let doctrine built on incomplete information cost lives the next time a countdown reaches 0 before help arrives." Commander Rendell closed the display in front of her slowly, and when she looked up, her expression had changed into something I had rarely seen on her face before. Not fear, exactly, and not simple respect either. Something closer to the recalculation of a person who has just discovered that the ground beneath a familiar structure was never quite as solid as they believed. "I need to file a report about this," she said quietly, "and I suspect this conversation is going to travel a great deal further than this station once it does." "It usually does," Marlowe said, and there was something tired in the way she said it, the weariness of someone who had watched this same realization dawn on other officers before, in other rooms, after other quiet countdowns that had ended before anyone outside the room ever fully understood what had happened inside it. The debriefing room emptied slowly after that, officers filing out in 2s and 3s, speaking in low voices that dropped even lower whenever they passed close enough to notice Marlowe still standing near the window. I stayed behind, partly because Commander Rendell had asked me to help compile the incident report, and partly because I found I was not ready to simply walk away from the conversation we had just had. Marlowe was looking out at the docking bay beyond the window, where maintenance crews were already repairing the damage caused by the initial breach. Her posture had relaxed slightly now that the immediate crisis had passed, though I noticed she still stood in a way that kept the door within her sight line, an old habit that I suspected she was not even fully aware of anymore. "Can I ask you something?" I said, "that has nothing to do with the report." She turned toward me, and for the first time since I had met her, there was something almost like curiosity in her expression rather than the careful neutrality she usually wore. "Go ahead. How do you carry it?" I asked. "What you did in that room, what Corin described happening on that cargo vessel, how does a person do something like that and then simply move on to the next task, filing reports and eating meals and standing quietly in briefings as though nothing happened at all?" Marlowe was quiet for a long moment, and I thought perhaps she would deflect the question the way she had deflected Commander Rendell's earlier questions about method and tactics. Instead, she answered honestly, in a voice that had lost some of its earlier flatness. "I don't carry it easily," she said. "I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a temptation, after watching something like what happened today, to assume the person who did it must feel nothing at all, and that assumption is almost as dangerous as the one your doctrine makes about humans being too slow to matter. I feel it. I will probably feel it again tonight, and maybe for several nights after that. But feeling something and being controlled by it are different things, and my training, my whole life really, has been about learning to separate the two." "That sounds like a heavy thing to learn," I said. "It is," she said, "but I think about the alternative, and the alternative is worse. If I had waited for backup today, if I had followed the doctrine your coalition built, and held position until additional units arrived, that alarm would have sounded within the time frame command projected. 42 civilians would have spent 40 minutes locked in a section of this station with 3 armed hostiles who had already shown they were willing to hurt people to get what they wanted. I have seen what happens in those 40 minutes, Officer Turan. I have seen the aftermath of situations where the doctrine was followed exactly as written, where officers waited exactly as long as procedure required, and I promise you, the outcome is not always what people imagine when they picture a careful, patient response to danger. I thought about the numbers again, the 11.4 seconds that the station's sensors had recorded, and how strange it was that something so brief could carry so much weight. "Corin said something that stayed with me," I said. "He said what unsettled him most was not what was done, but how calmly it was done. I think I understand that now in a way I did not an hour ago. We are taught to expect violence to look a certain way, loud and chaotic and driven by something recognizable, anger or fear or excitement. What you did today did not look like that at all, and I think that is part of why it is so hard for people like me to categorize it properly." "You're not wrong," Marlowe said, "and I think that gap in expectation is part of why my command has always been careful about how much of this gets shared with the rest of the Alliance. People are frightened by calm violence in a way they are not frightened by chaotic violence, even though calm is, in almost every measurable way, safer for everyone involved. Chaos is where mistakes happen. Chaos is where hostages get hurt by accident, where crossfire injures the people you were trying to protect. Calm, controlled action minimizes all of that, but it looks wrong to people who have never seen it before, and wrong things make people uneasy even when they are also safer." We were interrupted by Commander Rendell returning to the room, a datapad in her hand, and an expression that suggested the conversations happening beyond that debriefing room were moving faster than any of us had anticipated. "The incident report has already been flagged for review at the sector command level," she said, "and I've received a preliminary inquiry from 2 other station commanders in this system who want to understand what happened here today. Officer Marlowe, I suspect you're going to be asked to repeat portions of this conversation to people well above my position in the coming days." Marlowe nodded, unsurprised. "That tends to happen." "There's something else," Rendell continued, glancing between the two of us. "I pulled historical records after Officer Corin's account of the Velcane engagement. cross-referencing incident reports from the past decade that involved human units acting independently under time pressure. I found 11 similar cases across different sectors, all of them filed with minimal detail. All of them resolved faster than projected timelines suggested was possible, and all of them, without exception, involving outcomes where civilian casualties were avoided entirely, despite significant numbers of armed hostiles being present. 11 cases, I said, in a decade, and none of them were properly investigated at the time. They were investigated, Rendell said. The results were simply filed in a way that did not draw attention to the details, exactly as Officer Marlowe described her command preferring. Reading through them now, with the context we have from today, I can see the pattern clearly, but without that context, each individual report simply looked like a fortunate outcome, a well-trained unit that got lucky with timing. I doubt anyone reading them in isolation would have drawn the connection I'm seeing now. Marlowe's expression remained calm, but I noticed her shoulders had tightened slightly, and I understood she was bracing herself for whatever conversation was likely to follow this revelation, moving up through the Coalition's command structure. "Commander," she said, "I want to be clear about something, because I suspect this is going to matter a great deal in the coming days. What happened today, and what happened in those 11 other cases, was never about demonstrating superiority. It was about responding to situations where the standard doctrine's timeline for support would have resulted in preventable harm. My command does not want this capability weaponized as some kind of point of pride within the Alliance. We would genuinely prefer it remain a quiet, rarely used option rather than something showcased or celebrated." "I understand that concern," Rendell said, "but I think you should also understand that once information like this reaches Sector Command, the decision about how it gets used moves beyond either of our control. There will be officers who want to study this capability in detail, who will want to understand exactly how it works so it can be trained more broadly across the Alliance. There may be others who react with suspicion, wondering what else has been quietly filed away without proper context over the years. I cannot promise you how this unfolds from here, only that it will unfold, and probably faster than either of us would prefer." I watched Marlowe absorb this, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something that looked genuinely like weariness settle into her posture, the exhaustion of someone who understood that today's countdown, the one that had ended safely at 0 without ever triggering an alarm, was simply the beginning of a much longer and more complicated process that she had little control over. "May I make a request?" Marlowe said to Commander Rendell. "Of course. Whatever gets sent up through Sector Command, please make sure it includes the reasoning, not just the results," Marlowe said. "It would be easy for this to become a story about speed, about how quickly 3 hostiles were neutralized, and lose the actual point entirely. The point was never speed for its own sake. The point was that 42 civilians never had to spend even a single minute wondering whether they would be found in time. If people remember anything from today, I would rather they remember that than any detail about the method." Commander Rendell nodded slowly. "I'll make sure that's included." After she left the room again, carrying her datapad and the weight of a report that was clearly about to grow far more complicated than a simple incident summary, Marlowe and I stood together for a while, in a silence that felt different from the one that had filled that corridor outside the control room. That earlier silence had been tense, uncertain, filled with countdown numbers and unanswered questions. This silence felt more like the quiet after a storm has passed, when the immediate danger has cleared, but the work of understanding what happened is only beginning. "I owe you an apology," I said finally. Marlowe looked at me, surprised. "For what?" "For 19 years of assumptions I never bothered to question," I said. "For every briefing where I read a report, ranking your species near the bottom of combat efficiency and simply accepted it as fact, rather than wondering whether the numbers were measuring the right things at all. For standing in that corridor and thinking, even for a moment, that you needed my protection more than I needed to trust your judgment. You don't owe me an apology for believing what you were taught," Marlowe said. "Most people believe what they are taught, and most of the time that's a reasonable way to move through the world. I'm not angry that your doctrine was wrong, Officer Torin. I would simply ask that going forward, you remember today, the next time someone tells you a countdown is running, and a quiet person standing at the back of a briefing room offers to handle it alone. I thought about that for a long time after she said it, long after we had both returned to our regular duties, long after the maintenance crews had finished repairing the damage from that morning's breach, and the station had returned to its usual rhythms. I thought about the 42 civilians who would never know how close they had come to spending 40 minutes trapped with armed hostiles, who would go about their evening meals and their conversations with their families with no idea that a countdown had run silently in the background of their day and ended safely before it ever reached them. And I thought about every quiet human soldier I had ever served alongside, every unremarkable, careful, precisely spoken officer who filled out reports without embellishment and stood at the back of briefings without ever raising their voice, and I understood now that their silence was not the absence of capability. It was the presence of a discipline so deep and so carefully practiced that it had learned to make itself invisible, waiting patiently at the edges of every room until the moment it was truly needed. 3 weeks later, I was called into a meeting that I had not expected and did not, at first, understand the purpose of. Commander Rendell had been summoned to a briefing at Sector Command, and she had requested that I attend alongside her, along with Officer Corrin, and to my surprise, Elise Marlowe herself. The meeting took place aboard a larger command vessel 2 systems away, in a conference room far more formal than the small debriefing room where this had all begun, filled with officers I had only ever seen in official broadcasts. A senior human officer was present as well, a woman introduced simply as Fleet Director Halloway, who carried herself with the same quiet, unremarkable calm I had noticed in Marlowe from the very first day we served together. I understood now that this was not coincidence. It was training, passed down and reinforced across generations of a species that had learned, for reasons of survival I was only beginning to grasp, to hold their most dangerous capabilities close and quiet. "I've read the incident report from your station," Director Halloway said, addressing the room generally, but glancing briefly at Marlowe, with something that looked like recognition passing between them, one professional acknowledging another's difficult work. "And I've read the historical cases Commander Rendell identified while researching it. I want to begin by saying that Officer Marlowe acted correctly, both in the moment and afterward, in choosing to be transparent about what happened rather than allowing it to be filed away quietly, the way similar incidents have been in the past." "Director," said one of the sector command officers, a Caliph administrator whose name I did not catch, "with respect, I think many of us in this room are struggling to understand why this capability has never been formally disclosed before now. If human forces can achieve outcomes like this, that changes fundamental assumptions about force allocation across the entire alliance." "It does," Director Halloway agreed, "and that is precisely why my command has been cautious about how this information spreads. I want to be honest with everyone in this room about our reasoning, because I think Officer Marlowe was right when she said, during the initial debriefing, that context matters as much as the results." She paused, gathering her thoughts in a way that reminded me strongly of Marlowe's own careful, deliberate manner of speaking. "Humanity's history includes long periods where hesitation cost lives," she said. "Not in the abstract sense every species can claim about their own past, but in specific, repeated, generational patterns that shaped how we train our soldiers even now. We learned, over centuries, that the gap between recognizing a threat and acting against it was often the difference between protecting people and failing them. That lesson became deeply embedded in how we prepare our military forces, to the point where compressing that gap became one of the central goals of human combat training, regardless of species we might eventually serve alongside. "But you've kept this quiet," the Caliph administrator said. "For how long?" "Since the Coalition Alliance formed," Halloway said, "we made a deliberate choice early on to allow the standard threat assessment doctrine to stand largely unchallenged, because we believed, and still believe, that a species perceived as less capable is less likely to be tested, provoked, or drawn into unnecessary conflicts. We would rather be underestimated and rarely called upon to demonstrate this capability, than be seen as a threat and treated with the caution and suspicion that perception invites. I found myself thinking about 19 years of briefings, 19 years of doctrine that I had never once questioned, and how strange it felt to learn that the quiet officers standing at the back of every room had been making a choice this entire time, one that protected not just civilians in moments of crisis, but the fragile peace of an entire alliance, built on species who might otherwise have viewed humanity with fear rather than the comfortable, dismissive confidence the old doctrine encouraged. "What changes now?" Commander Rendell asked. "Now that this has surfaced formally, through a proper report, rather than a quiet filing?" Director Holloway glanced at Marlowe before answering, and something unspoken passed between them again, some understanding built from shared experience that I could only partially guess at. "I don't think we can put this back into the quiet filing it came from," Holloway said. "Not entirely, but I would ask this alliance to consider carefully how it uses this information going forward. My hope is not that human units become a showcase capability, deployed for demonstration, or treated as some kind of secret weapon to be revealed for advantage. My hope is that this alliance simply updates its threat assessment doctrine to reflect a more accurate picture, so that future situations like the one at your station do not depend on a single officer choosing to break protocol because she understood the doctrine's timeline would cost lives if followed exactly as written." "That seems a reasonable request," the Caliph administrator said slowly, "though I suspect there will be officers across this alliance who want to understand the training methods behind this capability, in case there are elements that could be taught more broadly." "Some elements can be taught," Marlowe said, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun. "The tactical thinking, the rapid assessment of a space, and its likely threats, the discipline of deciding on a course of action before doubt has time to take root. Those things can be trained into any species willing to commit the time and effort. But I want to be honest about something else, something I don't think gets said enough in conversations like this one. Part of what allows my people to act the way we do in moments like the one at that station comes from generations of pressure that none of us would wish on any other species. I would not consider what shaped this capability in humanity to be something worth replicating, even if the outcome, in isolated moments like the one 3 weeks ago, saved lives that might otherwise have been lost." The room fell quiet at that, and I understood, more clearly than I had at any point during the past 3 weeks, that what I had witnessed in that control room was not simply a skill to be studied and copied, but the visible result of something far older and heavier, a history I would never fully understand from the outside, carried quietly by people who had learned to make their capability invisible until the moment it was truly needed. The meeting continued for another hour, discussing practical adjustments to doctrine, timelines for support units, revised protocols for situations involving time-sensitive threats. I listened to most of it with only partial attention, my thoughts still circling back to that corridor outside the control room, to the 11.4 seconds that had changed the way I understood an entire species, to Corin's account of a cargo hold 3 years earlier where 6 soldiers had moved through 42 armed hostiles without ever raising an alarm. When the meeting finally ended and officers began filing out of the conference room, I found myself walking alongside Marlowe once more, back toward the transport that would carry us home to our own station. "How do you feel?" I asked her, "now that this is no longer something quietly filed away?" She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Relieved in some ways," she said. "I've never liked how much of this stayed hidden, how many officers like Corin carried memories they couldn't properly discuss, because the truth felt too strange to be believed. But I'm also cautious. Being understood correctly is different from being understood completely, and I worry this alliance will focus on what my people can do in a crisis, without ever asking why we learned to do it in the first place, or what it costs the people who carry that capability every day, even when they never need to use it." "I don't think I can fully understand that cost," I admitted, "but I think I understand more today than I did 3 weeks ago, and I suspect that understanding will keep growing the longer I serve alongside people like you." Marlowe gave me something close to a smile then, small and tired but genuine. "That's usually how it starts," she said. "One countdown, one quiet room, one person who decides to ask the right question instead of simply accepting the old doctrine because it was comfortable to believe." We reached the transport in silence after that, and as the doors closed around us for the journey home, I found myself thinking not about speed or violence or the 11.4 seconds that had reshaped my understanding of an entire species, but about the 42 civilians who had gone about their evening 3 weeks earlier without ever knowing how close they had come to danger, protected by a quiet woman who filled out reports precisely and stood at the back of briefings, asking nothing in return except that the people who mattered most were kept safe, and that the truth, however uncomfortable, eventually found its way into the light where it belonged. The station doctrine has since been rewritten, quietly, without fanfare, in language careful enough that most who read it will never fully grasp the history behind the changes. But I know now, and Corin knows, and Commander Rendell knows, and somewhere across this alliance, a growing number of officers are beginning to understand what I learned that day, in a corridor, lit with amber emergency light, watching a countdown reach 0 without ever needing to sound its alarm. They said humans could not kill quickly. They were wrong about the speed, and they were wrong about the reason, and I suspect it will take this alliance a very long time to fully understand either.